Have you ever witnessed that perfect moment when arrogance meets its match? When someone so convinced of their own moral superiority walks straight into a lesson they never saw coming? That's exactly what happened when Olivia Reed, a rising star in progressive journalism, decided to take on Clint Eastwood, not realizing she was about to become the cautionary tale that would echo through Hollywood for years to come. What happened next left an entire room of Hollywood elites speechless. The ballroom at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel was a spectacle of elegance that evening. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling, bathing the room in warm, golden light that bounced off gold-trimmed walls and illuminated faces that regularly graced magazine covers and silver screens. The air was thick with the scent of aged whiskey, expensive perfume, and the subtle tension that always lingered when Hollywood's elite gathered under one roof. You could almost taste the ambition in the room, sweet like champagne, but with a bitter aftertaste of insecurity that no amount of success could ever quite wash away. Guests in tailored suits worth more than most Americans' monthly salaries and designer gowns that had never seen the inside of a department store floated from table to table. Their voices formed a controlled murmur of industry gossip, forced laughter, and backhanded compliments disguised as praise. Some were here for the cause. Tonight's gala was in support of veterans' mental health initiatives. But for many, it was just another photo opportunity, a chance to be seen, to network, to reinforce their place in the industry's unforgiving pecking order. And then Clint Eastwood walked in. No entourage, no grand entrance, no announcement. Just him in a well-fitted black suit, hands tucked casually into his pockets, exuding the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need an introduction or validation from anyone in the room. At 94 years old, he moved slower than he used to, but there was still something in his posture, something in the way his eyes scanned the room, that commanded respect without demanding it. He carried himself like a man who had nothing to prove, because he had already proven everything that mattered. Conversation shifted mid-sentence as he passed. Eyes darted in his direction. A few guests whispered to their companions, some pointing discreetly. He wasn't the kind of celebrity you fawned over or rushed to take selfies with. You acknowledged him. You respected him. You understood that you were in the presence of living history. He approached a small group near the bar, greeted a couple of longtime friends with a firm handshake, the kind men of his generation still believed meant something, and leaned in slightly to hear their conversation over the soft jazz playing in the background. He wasn't one for small talk, but he had a way of making people feel like what they were saying mattered, a rare trait in a room full of people who were often just waiting for their turn to speak. Across the ballroom, a young journalist named Olivia Reed was watching with the calculated intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. With her asymmetrical purple-streaked bob, smashed the patriarchy pin subtly attached to her designer blazer, and a phone case emblazoned with "The future is female," Olivia wasn't just attending the gala. She was on a mission. In the world of progressive political commentary, she was making a name for herself as the fearless, no-nonsense voice of a new generation of feminists. Her articles, mostly scathing attacks on toxic masculinity and outdated patriarchal figures, had gotten her a substantial following on social media and a reputation as someone who wasn't afraid to dismantle systems of oppression, as her Twitter bio proudly proclaimed. Tonight, she saw an opportunity that was too perfect to pass up. Clint Eastwood was the embodiment of everything her platform stood against: the hypermasculinity, the traditional values, the refusal to bend to new progressive ideologies. In Olivia's mind, Eastwood represented everything wrong with old Hollywood, a relic from an era that needed to be dismantled rather than celebrated. Olivia was going to make a statement. She was going to create a moment. She was going to show everyone in that room that the old guard was finally being held accountable by women who would no longer remain silent. But something in her expression, a mix of righteous indignation and barely contained excitement, hinted at the fact that she had already decided how this confrontation would go. She wasn't here for a discussion. She wasn't here to listen or understand. She was here for a takedown, a viral clip that would boost her profile and cement her reputation as a fearless feminist journalist. What she didn't realize was that she had no idea who she was dealing with. Olivia Reed adjusted her blazer, checked her recording app one last time, and grabbed her phone, already set to capture what she was certain would be a career-defining moment. She wasn't nervous. She was confident. Too confident. This wasn't just about calling out an old actor's outdated views. It was about making a scene, creating a viral moment that would be shared across social media platforms before the night was over. As she approached, the energy at the bar shifted slightly. A few guests took a step back, sensing an interruption to the natural flow of conversation. Clint Eastwood, in the middle of listening to a war veteran's story about his time in Afghanistan, barely acknowledged the young woman's presence. That only fueled Olivia's determination. She cleared her throat, flashing a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. Olivia Reed, the progressive voice. "Mind if I ask you a few questions about your legacy?" Eastwood gave her a glance, brief, unreadable, then turned back to his conversation as if Olivia were nothing more than a passing waiter. Olivia didn't like that. Not one bit. She took a small step closer, invading the invisible boundary of personal space that separated strangers from acquaintances. "I'll make it quick," she added, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "I just wanted to get your thoughts on, well, Hollywood's changing landscape. You've been in the industry for over 60 years. Do you think men like you still have a place in it?" The subtle jab was intentional, calculated. The words "men like you" hung in the air, heavy with implication. A few guests nearby turned their attention to the exchange. Someone set their drink down a little too loudly. Even the bartender, mid-pour, paused for half a second, eyes flicking toward the brewing confrontation. Clint Eastwood finally looked at her, his gaze steady and penetrating, like a man deciding whether or not something was worth his time. There was no anger there, no offense taken, just a quiet assessment that made Olivia feel suddenly exposed, as if Eastwood could see right through her to the desperate ambition that fueled her every move. But Olivia pressed on, committed to her performance. "Because you know," she continued, gaining momentum, "Hollywood is evolving. The old ways of thinking, the toxic masculinity, She made a vague hand gesture, dismissive and condescending. "Regressive values. Women and marginalized voices are finally being heard. A lot of people believe it's time to move forward, that men like you are out of touch with what modern audiences want." There it was, the line Olivia had been waiting to say. The setup was perfect. She was on camera, in front of an audience, standing toe-to-toe with a Hollywood legend. This was her moment. She could already picture the headline. "Feminist journalist calls out. Clint Eastwood, watch him crumble under scrutiny." But that headline was about to fall apart, because Clint Eastwood wasn't the one crumbling. Folks, if you're enjoying this story so far, give this video a thumbs up right now. Where are you watching from? Type your state in the comments below. I love seeing all the patriots tuning in from across America. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and join our community of truth seekers. Now, let's continue with what happened next. For a second, Clint Eastwood just looked at her, not with anger, not with offense, just the kind of stare that made a woman question if she'd made the right decision. A slow, steady silence stretched between them, pulling in the attention of everyone within earshot like a black hole drawing in light. Then Eastwood sighed, not the kind of sigh that came from exhaustion, but the kind that signaled complete and utter disinterest in the performance he was witnessing. He reached for his drink, took a small sip, then set it back down before finally speaking. "You rehearsed that one in the car on the way over?" he asked, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly texture that had commanded movie screens for decades. A chuckle rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, low but unmistakable. Someone whispered, "Classic Eastwood," and another person stifled a laugh behind their hand. Olivia's cheeks flushed pink, but she kept her composure, doubling down with the practiced indignation she'd perfected on social media. "I'm just asking the questions that women and marginalized communities want answers to," she shot back, adjusting her stance to appear more authoritative. Eastwood tilted his head slightly, studying her like a curious artifact. "Women and marginalized communities," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "Or just you?" Olivia hesitated. That wasn't part of the script in her head. She was supposed to be the one asking questions, controlling the narrative, exposing outdated thinking. But somehow, with just a few words, Eastwood had flipped the dynamic. The veteran actor leaned forward slightly, resting an elbow on the bar. His eyes, still sharp despite his age, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her want to look away. "You think the world just moves forward because some woman with a keyboard and a cause says so?" he asked. "That real change happens because somebody like you points a finger and says, 'That's old, throw it out'?" Olivia opened her mouth to respond with one of her prepared talking points about dismantling patriarchal systems, but Eastwood didn't give her the chance. "Let me tell you something, kid." His voice was steady, measured, the same tone he used in 100 films when delivering a line that sent chills through the screen. "You don't erase the past just because you don't like it. You learn from it. You build on it. You take what worked, fix what didn't, and move forward. That's progress, not whatever the hell this is." He gestured vaguely at Olivia, mimicking her earlier dismissive hand wave. This time the chuckle from the crowd was louder. Someone actually clapped. A woman in her 60s nodded approvingly, whispering something to her companion. Olivia's face reddened further, the heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck, but she wasn't ready to back down. She had built her entire brand on confronting powerful men. She couldn't walk away now. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood," she said, voice a little tighter than before, "it's easy for you to talk about learning from the past, when you were part of a generation of men that had it easier, that didn't have to fight for basic representation, that benefited from a system designed to elevate men like you while silencing women's voices." A murmur ran through the room, not in Olivia's favor. A few guests exchanged glances, unimpressed by the bold but flimsy argument. Even some of the younger women in attendance seemed uncomfortable with her approach. Eastwood let out a short laugh, shaking his head like a man who'd heard it all before. "Easier?" He repeated the word like it was the dumbest thing he'd heard all night. "I started in Hollywood when they still told actors like me to change their name, because it sounded too rough. I worked as a bricklayer before I ever got in front of a camera. You think it was easier?" He let the words hang for a beat, the weight of decades of experience behind them. "You ever had to shovel asphalt in the middle of summer just to afford a meal? Ever had to sleep in your car between auditions? Ever had to take roles you hated just to keep the lights on?" Olivia blinked. She had not been prepared for that. Her research on Eastwood had focused on finding problematic quotes and controversial political stances, not on understanding the man's actual journey. She had come armed for an ideological battle, but was suddenly faced with the messy reality of a human life that didn't fit neatly into her narrative. But Eastwood wasn't done. "I've seen people like you before," he said, taking another sip of his drink. "Looking for a soundbite, hoping to make a scene. But here's the thing. You walked in here thinking I was going to fold, that I'd get mad, stumble over my words, maybe even storm off." He shrugged, the gesture casual, but somehow powerful. "But I don't do performances on command. That's your job." The audience laughed again, this time not just a few, but nearly half the room. A couple of guests actually applauded openly. Even a young actress known for her vocal feminism couldn't help but smile at the perfectly delivered line. Olivia felt it, that creeping awareness that this wasn't going the way she planned. The narrative was slipping through her fingers like sand, and it was about to get worse. Her confidence cracked, but she refused to show it. She forced a smirk, adjusting her posture like she still had control of the situation. But the problem was she had already lost. She just hadn't figured it out yet. She cleared her throat, reaching for anything to regain momentum. "All right, so maybe you had some struggles," she said, her voice not as sharp as before. "But don't you think there's a reason men your age are being left behind in Hollywood? Maybe audiences don't want outdated ideas about masculinity and gender roles shoved down their throats anymore. Maybe women are tired of being relegated to love interests and victims in the stories men like you tell." Eastwood let out a short chuckle, the kind that wasn't amused, just disappointed, like a teacher watching a promising student make the same mistake again. "Left behind?" he repeated, shaking his head slowly. "Ma'am, I've outlived entire Hollywood trends, been written off more times than I can count. And yet here I am." He gestured around the room, at the gala being held in his honor, at the crowd hanging on his every word. "And here you are, talking to me, at my table, at my event, using my name to try and make a headline." Olivia had no response to that. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Damn," under their breath. Another whispered, "She walked right into that one." The moment stretched, and the weight of it settled in Olivia's stomach like a stone. Her audience wasn't on her side anymore. They weren't nodding along, waiting for her to take down a Hollywood relic. They were watching her squirm, witnessing the moment her carefully constructed takedown fell apart. The silence became unbearable, so Olivia scrambled for an escape. "I just think people deserve better," she blurted out. "Better stories, better representation, better—" Eastwood cut her off with a slow, knowing nod. "So tell them one." Olivia blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "You keep saying what people don't want." Eastwood leaned back in his chair, the posture of a man completely at ease. "So tell them what they do want. Go ahead, right now. Say something that'll matter more than the movies I've made, the people I've worked with, or the history I've been a part of." The words hit like a gut punch. Olivia had nothing. Her hands curled slightly at her sides, her breath uneven. Her entire game had been about tearing someone else down. But now, standing in front of Clint Eastwood, she was being asked to build something instead. And she couldn't do it. A small, humiliating bead of sweat formed at her temple. She tried to ignore the way the room felt smaller, the way people were whispering, the way her own plan had turned against her. "Thought so," Eastwood finally said, picking up his drink again. The crowd laughed once more, but this time it wasn't just amusement, it was finality. The conversation was over. Olivia had lost, and everyone knew it. Olivia Reed swallowed hard, the heat of humiliation spreading across her face like wildfire. She had walked into this confrontation certain that she'd come out looking like the voice of a new era, the brave journalist who finally called out an icon of toxic masculinity. Instead, she stood there exposed, stripped down to nothing but a young woman who had overestimated herself in the presence of someone who had already seen it all. The chatter in the room had shifted. Conversations resumed, laughter hummed through the air, but every now and then eyes flicked back toward her, some amused, some pitying, others just indifferent. Olivia hated that last one the most, because that meant she wasn't even worth the outrage. Her phone was still recording. The red light blinked steadily, capturing every excruciating second of her failure. With trembling fingers, she stopped the recording and slipped the device into her pocket. There would be no viral moment tonight, at least not the kind she had hoped for. Without another word, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the crowd. No goodbyes, no last words, no grand exit. Just a woman who had overplayed her hand and lost in front of an audience that would remember long after she was gone. Eastwood watched her go, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even seem particularly invested in the outcome. He simply took another sip of his drink, then turned back to the veteran he had been speaking to before the interruption. "Now," he said, like nothing had happened, "you were saying something about your time in Fallujah." And just like that, the moment passed. The veteran, grateful for the return to their conversation, continued his story about the brotherhood he'd found in the most unlikely of places. But a few feet away, a middle-aged producer shook her head, chuckling softly. "You know," she said, leaning in toward Eastwood, "you didn't have to do her like that." Eastwood raised an eyebrow. "I didn't do anything." The producer smirked. "Oh, come on! You let that girl walk right into a buzzsaw." Eastwood finally cracked a small grin, the kind that had charmed audiences for decades. "She walked into it herself," he said simply. "I just didn't move it out of the way." The producer laughed, nodding in agreement. "You know they'll twist this," she said. "Her outlet will make you look like the villain, the old man who couldn't handle being questioned by a strong woman." Eastwood gave a small shrug, the gesture of a man who had long ago stopped caring about such things. "They've been doing that for years," he said simply. "Doesn't change the truth." Across the room, another guest muttered to a friend, "Man, these people really think they can outtalk Clint Eastwood." The friend chuckled, shaking his head. "They keep trying, though." "But every time," the first guest replied, "the outcome is the same." Meanwhile, in the ladies' room, Olivia stood before the mirror, trying to compose herself. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of embarrassment that still colored her cheeks. She splashed cold water on her wrists, a trick her mother had taught her to calm down in stressful situations. Her mother. What would she think of this disaster? The woman who had raised her to stand up for herself, to speak truth to power, to never back down. Would she be disappointed? Or would she remind Olivia of the other lessons she'd taught? To listen before speaking, to understand before judging, to respect experience even when challenging it. As she dabbed her face dry with a plush hand towel, Olivia caught the eye of an older woman who had entered the bathroom, a veteran actress in her 70s, who had broken barriers for women in Hollywood long before hashtags and viral moments. "Rough night?" the woman asked, her voice kind but knowing. Olivia nodded, unable to find words. "He's something else, isn't he?" the older woman said, applying a fresh coat of lipstick with the steady hand of someone who had done it thousands of times before. "I thought I was prepared," Olivia admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I had all these points, all these arguments." The older actress smiled, not unkindly, but with the wisdom of someone who had seen many young firebrands come and go. "You know," she said, "I disagreed with Clint on just about everything political for 50 years. Fought him on set, fought him in the press, fought him at fundraisers." She capped her lipstick and turned to face Olivia fully. But I never made the mistake of thinking he was just what I wanted him to be. He's complicated, contradictory, infuriating, and one of the most genuine people in an industry built on fakery." She patted Olivia's arm gently. "Next time, try listening before you load your guns. You might be surprised what you learn." With that, she walked out, leaving Olivia alone with a reflection that suddenly looked younger and less certain than it had just hours before. The night carried on as these nights always did. Champagne flowed, deals were whispered over candlelit tables, and the hum of Hollywood's elite filled the room once more. But one lesson lingered, not just for Olivia Reed, but for everyone who had watched the exchange unfold. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about generations. It wasn't even about winning or losing. It was about wisdom versus arrogance. Clint Eastwood had seen it all. Hard work, rejection, grit, success, failure, resilience. He had lived long enough to understand that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one with something worth saying. Olivia Reed. She was part of a world where performative outrage was currency, where calling someone out was easier than doing something meaningful. She thought she could walk into a room, throw around some buzzwords, and tear down a legend. But the problem with tearing something down, it doesn't mean you've built anything. And that was Olivia's mistake. She had spent her time waiting for someone else to fall instead of learning how to stand on her own. By the time she slipped out of the gala, she was just another name in a long list of people who had underestimated the old cowboy. Clint Eastwood didn't need to prove anything. He never did. He let his work speak for itself, let time be the judge of what mattered, and let the people who tried to erase history fade into irrelevance on their own. Because in the end, it's not about who screams the loudest. It's about who actually has something to say. 3 days later, Olivia sat in her small but trendy apartment, staring at her laptop screen. The article she had planned to write about her takedown of Clint Eastwood remained unfinished, a blinking cursor mocking her from an empty document. She had tried several times to spin the encounter in her favor. She'd written drafts portraying Eastwood as dismissive of women's concerns, as a relic unable to engage with modern discourse, as a privileged man who couldn't handle being challenged. But each attempt rang hollow, even to her own ears. The truth was, she hadn't been silenced by the patriarchy that night. She'd been outmatched by someone who had earned their wisdom through decades of living. Her phone buzzed with another notification. Since that night, her social media had been flooded with comments, not the supportive ones she was used to, but brutal assessments of her performance. Someone had recorded the entire exchange on their phone, and the video had gone viral, just not in the way she had hoped. Feminist journalist destroyed by Clint Eastwood. When virtue signaling meets actual virtue. This is what happens when you bring Twitter arguments to real life. The comments stung, but what hurt more was knowing they weren't entirely wrong. With a sigh, she closed her laptop and walked to the window of her apartment, looking out at the Los Angeles skyline. The city that had once seemed full of opportunity now felt like a maze where she had taken a wrong turn. Her phone rang. It was her editor. "Please tell me you have something good on the Eastwood encounter," he said without preamble. "The video's everywhere. We need our angle on this." Olivia hesitated. "I'm still working on it." "Work faster. This is exactly the kind of content our readers want. Old Hollywood's Last Stand or something like that. Make him the villain." She thought about the veteran actress's words in the bathroom, about listening before loading your guns. What if? She started, then paused, gathering courage. What if he wasn't the villain in this story? The silence on the other end was deafening. "Excuse me," her editor finally said. Have you forgotten what our platform stands for? We don't humanize the opposition. We expose them. Even if that means twisting the truth? Another long pause. Look, Olivia, I don't know what happened to you at that gala, but you need to remember who pays your bills. We have a narrative. Stick to it. After the call ended, Olivia sat for a long time, thinking about narratives and truth, and the space between them. She thought about Clint Eastwood's words. You don't erase the past just because you don't like it. You learn from it. Maybe it was time she learned something. She opened her laptop again and started a new document. This time, she didn't try to spin or manipulate. She simply wrote what happened, honestly and without agenda. She wrote about walking into that room convinced of her own righteousness. She wrote about the humbling experience of having her assumptions challenged. She wrote about the difference between fighting for progress and simply fighting. When she finished, she read it over. It wasn't the article her editor wanted. It probably wasn't the article her followers wanted. But it was true. She titled it, What Clint Eastwood Taught Me About Listening. With a deep breath, she hit send. The response was immediate and polarizing. Some of her regular readers accused her of selling out, of being intimidated into silence. Others praised her honesty and self-reflection. The comments section became a battlefield of competing ideologies. But something unexpected happened, too. People who had never read her work before started sharing the article. It crossed political lines in a way none of her previous pieces had. Even people who disagreed with her politics found something valuable in her willingness to reconsider her approach. A week later, she received an email that made her heart stop. Ms. Reed, I read your article. Not bad. You got most of it right. If you're ever interested in a real conversation instead of a confrontation, my door is open. Clint Eastwood. She read it 3 times, making sure it wasn't a prank. It wasn't. That evening, as the sun set over Los Angeles, Olivia Reed understood something that had eluded her throughout her career. True strength isn't found in tearing others down. It's found in the courage to build something meaningful, even if that means rebuilding yourself first. The world is full of people looking for their gotcha moment, quick to criticize, quick to cancel, but slow to actually contribute. But here's the truth. Tearing someone down doesn't make you important. Building something real does. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can build is a bridge. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below telling me where you're from and what you thought about this encounter. Was Clint right? Was Olivia wrong? Or is the truth somewhere in between? Remember, in a world where everyone's shouting, sometimes the most revolutionary act is to listen. And if you want more stories that cut through the noise and get to what really matters, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Because some voices, they don't fade with time. They only get stronger